Hey Reddit. I never thought I'd be writing here, but I need to get this off my chest. I, 27F, grew up in a family where my older brother was always the future star, and I was, well, the backup plan. From the day I was born, my parents made it clear, not directly in words at first, but through actions, that he was their pride and hope, while I was just there in the background. Family stories always revolved around him, his talents, his potential, his big future. Meanwhile, my achievements were treated like small side notes. If I did well in school, it was expected. If he did anything even average, it was celebrated like a miracle. At family gatherings, relatives would ask him about his dreams and plans, while I was usually asked to help in the kitchen or keep quiet. The difference in treatment wasn't loud or dramatic at first, it was subtle but constant. Better gifts for him, more patience with his mistakes, more attention to his feelings. I learned early that if something went wrong, I was expected to handle it alone, while he was protected and defended no matter what. The only person who truly saw me was my grandmother. She was the one who listened when I felt invisible. She told me that my worth wasn't determined by how my parents treated me, but growing up surrounded by comparison still affected my confidence more than I realized at the time. Back then I didn't fully understand why I always felt like I had to prove myself twice as much just to get half the recognition. I just knew that no matter how hard I tried, I was always standing in my brother's shadow. And that constant comparison was only the beginning of everything that came later. As my brother and I got older, the comparison stopped being subtle and became painfully obvious. Every report card turned into a competition I never signed up for. If I got a 10 out of 12, my parents would say, "Why not a perfect score like your brother?" If he barely passed something, they'd say, "He's just focusing on bigger things, he has real potential." At first I tried to keep up. I studied harder, joined extracurriculars, tried to be the easy child who never caused trouble. But no matter what I achieved, it never felt like enough. I remember once winning a regional academic award. I was so excited, it felt like proof that I mattered too. When I showed my parents, they congratulated me quickly, and then immediately asked how my brother's football practice went. Small moments like that stacked up over the years. Family dinners turned into subtle comparisons, my brother's future business ideas were discussed for hours, while my goals were brushed off as safe or ordinary. Even when relatives praised me, my parents would redirect the conversation back to him. The worst part wasn't the unfairness, it was how it slowly affected how I saw myself. I started doubting my abilities. I avoided talking about my dreams because I expected them to be dismissed. I learned to celebrate my successes quietly because sharing them felt pointless. There were nights I lay awake wondering what was wrong with me, why love and approval always felt conditional. I began believing that maybe I really was just the backup child, someone who existed to support the main character of the family. The only person who reminded me otherwise was my grandmother. She'd sit with me, listen without comparing, and tell me that one day I'd build a life that reflected my own strength, not my parents' expectations. At the time, I didn't fully believe her. But those words stayed with me, and they became the quiet motivation that pushed me toward the next chapter of my life. By the time I finished high school, I had already decided one thing: I needed to leave. Not because I hated my family, but because staying meant constantly feeling smaller than I actually was. I applied to a prestigious university in another city, honestly not expecting much support from my parents. When my acceptance letter arrived, I was shaking. It felt like a doorway into a completely different life, one where I could finally exist without constant comparison. My parents' reaction was predictable. A quick "that's nice," followed by a long conversation about my brother's future plans. They didn't offer financial help or much encouragement. It was clear they didn't see my education as an investment worth making. That's when my grandmother stepped in. Without hesitation, she told me she would help cover my tuition. She said she believed in my potential and wanted me to have the opportunities one deserved. I remember crying, not just from relief, but from finally feeling truly supported by someone who saw me for who I was. Moving away was both terrifying and freeing. For the first time, I was surrounded by people who didn't know my family's narrative about me. Professors valued my work. Classmates respected my ideas. Slowly, my confidence started rebuilding, piece by piece. University life wasn't easy. I worked part-time jobs, studied late into the night, and sometimes felt lonely being far from home. But every small success felt like proof that I could stand on my own. And every time I doubted myself, my grandmother's voice echoed in my mind reminding me that I was capable. Meanwhile, back home, my parents kept focusing on my brother's big future. They rarely asked about my classes or achievements unless it somehow related to him. And honestly, that distance helped me realize something important: I wasn't defined by their expectations anymore. Graduation day felt surreal. Standing there with my degree in hand, I realized I had built something entirely on my own, with the love of one person who truly believed in me. And that was just the beginning of a life I was finally creating for myself. After graduation, I moved to a new city with nothing but my degree, a couple of suitcases, and a lot of quiet determination. I didn't have family connections or financial backup, just the belief my grandmother had planted in me that I could build something real on my own. My first job interview felt different from anything I'd experienced growing up. The hiring manager actually listened to me. He asked about my ideas, my goals, my experiences, not how I compared to anyone else. When I got the job offer, I remember sitting on my tiny rented bed just staring at the email, realizing this was the first big step in a life that was truly mine. The workplace surprised me. My team was supportive, collaborative, and respectful. People valued my effort and creativity. My boss gave constructive feedback instead of criticism disguised as comparison. For the first time, I felt like I belonged somewhere because of who I was, not because I was trying to live up to someone else's expectations. Slowly, my confidence started growing in ways I didn't expect. I began speaking up more in meetings. I took on new projects. I made friends who celebrated my achievements without turning them into competitions. Every small success, finishing a challenging assignment, receiving positive feedback, being trusted with bigger responsibilities, felt like a quiet victory over the years of doubt I carried from childhood. Back home, my parents rarely asked about my work unless they needed something. Conversations still revolved around my brother's plans and dreams. But instead of feeling crushed by that, I started feeling distant. Not cold, just independent. I was learning that validation didn't have to come from them. For the first time in my life, I woke up excited about the future. I was building something stable, something healthy, surrounded by people who respected me. And as my career continued to grow, I realized I was finally becoming the person my younger self had hoped to be: strong, capable, and standing firmly on my own path. A few years into my job, things started going really well. I worked hard, saved aggressively, and slowly built financial stability, something I had never seen growing up. Promotions came, my salary improved, and for the first time in my life I felt secure enough to think about long-term goals. One evening, after reviewing my savings and realizing how far I had come, a wild thought crossed my mind: what if I bought my own place? At first it felt impossible. I was the backup daughter, the one no one expected big things from. But the numbers made sense, and my boss, who had become a strong mentor, encouraged me to believe in my own progress. The process wasn't easy. There were endless documents, stressful meetings, and moments where old doubts crept in telling me I wasn't capable of such a big step. But every time fear appeared, I remembered how far I had come without my parents' support. I reminded myself that this was my life, built through years of determination. The day I got the keys to my new house is something I'll never forget. Standing inside that empty space, I felt a wave of emotions: pride, relief, disbelief. Every wall represented independence. Every room felt like proof that I was more than the role my family had given me. I called my grandmother first. She cried with happiness and told me she always knew I would create something beautiful for myself. When I told my parents, their reaction was distant. A quick congratulations, followed by a long conversation about my brother's newest business idea. It stung a little, but it didn't destroy me like it once would have. For the first time, I realized I didn't need their validation to feel proud. I had built a life, a career, and now a home entirely on my own terms. But while my life was moving forward, things back home were starting to change, and not in the way anyone expected. Not long after I settled into my new home, I started hearing different stories from back home, and for once, they weren't about my brother's bright future. Apparently, things weren't going well for him. The business plans my parents had bragged about for years never really took off. Projects failed. Opportunities disappeared. Slowly, the image they had built around him started cracking. At first, I didn't think much of it. Everyone struggles sometimes, and I genuinely hoped he would find his way. But then I learned that instead of pushing him to grow, my parents started protecting him even more. They blamed bad luck, other people, and unfair circumstances, anything except his choices. Eventually, he moved back in with them. What shocked me wasn't just that he needed help, it was how completely they rearranged their lives around him. Financial support, emotional protection, constant reassurance. Meanwhile, they still barely asked about my work or my achievements unless it somehow related to what I could do for him. Conversations with my parents changed tone. Instead of ignoring my progress, they began mentioning how lucky I was and how I should remember family comes first. I could feel a subtle shift, not pride in my independence, but expectation. It was like my success suddenly became a resource they might need to rely on. When I talked to my brother, he sounded bitter. He joked about how easy my life must be now. There was an edge in his voice I had never heard before, a mix of frustration and resentment. I tried to be supportive, offering encouragement without judgment, but our conversations felt tense and distant. Deep down, I sensed that the balance in our family was changing, and not in a healthy way. My parents were clinging to the version of him they had always believed in, while quietly beginning to look at me differently, not as the backup child anymore, but as someone who might solve their problems. And that shift would soon create a conflict I never saw coming. At first, I thought the tension with my brother was just frustration about his situation. I tried to be understanding. I knew failure could be hard, especially when someone had grown up being told they were destined for greatness. But I didn't realize how far his resentment would go until my life started falling apart out of nowhere. It began with small, confusing moments at work. A colleague asked me if everything was okay at home, in a strange, concerned tone. Another coworker started acting distant, like they were unsure how to talk to me. My boss scheduled an unexpected meeting, saying there were concerns about my reliability and behavior. I was completely blindsided. Soon after, I started hearing whispers, stories that weren't just exaggerated but completely false. Claims that I had cheated people financially, that I was unstable, that I had manipulated others to get where I was. None of it made sense, until someone finally mentioned that these rumors had come from people connected to my hometown. My stomach dropped when I realized the source. My brother had been talking to relatives, mutual acquaintances, and even some people loosely connected to my workplace through social networks. He painted a story where I wasn't hardworking or successful, just lucky, dishonest, and selfish for abandoning family. The consequences hit fast. My boss asked serious questions. HR got involved. I even received a warning that my position could be at risk if the concerns turned out to be true. At the same time, my landlord contacted me after hearing strange claims about my financial stability, putting my housing security under pressure too. I remember sitting alone in my house, the home I had worked so hard to buy, feeling like everything I built was suddenly crumbling because of lies I never expected from my own family. The fear was overwhelming. Not just fear of losing my job or home, but the shock that my brother would go this far out of jealousy. For a moment, I felt completely powerless. But that feeling didn't last forever. Because something inside me refused to let years of hard work be destroyed by false stories, even if they came from someone who once stood beside me as family. After the initial shock faded, survival mode kicked in. I realized that staying quiet and hoping the rumors would disappear wasn't an option. Too much was at stake: my job, my home, and the reputation I had spent years building from scratch. The first thing I did was gather proof. Emails from projects I led, performance reviews, financial records, anything that clearly showed my work ethic and stability. I contacted people who had worked closely with me and asked if they would be willing to confirm my professionalism if needed. It felt uncomfortable at first, but their support reminded me that I wasn't alone. The meeting with my boss and HR was one of the most stressful moments of my life. I walked in prepared for the worst, but instead of breaking down, I calmly presented facts and documentation. I explained where the rumors might have come from without turning it into an emotional attack, just clear, honest information. Slowly, I saw their skepticism turn into understanding. Over the next few weeks, the truth came out. People realized the stories about me didn't match reality. My team stood by me. My boss publicly reassured others that my work and reputation were strong. That moment, hearing my name defended by people who actually knew me, felt like a huge weight lifting off my chest. The housing situation also stabilized once I provided clear proof of my financial security. My landlord apologized for reacting too quickly to outside gossip. It wasn't an easy process, but step by step I rebuilt the trust that had been shaken by lies. When everything finally settled, I felt stronger than ever, not because the situation had been fair, but because I had faced it head-on and protected what I built. The fear that once overwhelmed me turned into quiet confidence. But just as I started breathing normally again, my parents suddenly reached out, not with apologies, not with concern, but with something that shocked me even more. Not long after the rumors were cleared and my life finally started stabilizing again, my parents reached out. At first, I thought maybe they wanted to apologize, or at least acknowledge everything I had gone through because of my brother's actions. Part of me hoped they would finally see how much pain their favoritism had caused. But the conversation took a completely different turn. They didn't ask how I was doing. They didn't mention the damage the rumors had done to my career or mental health. Instead, they started talking about my brother, how hard things were for him, how unfair life had been, how much support he needed to get back on his feet. Then came the real reason for the call: they expected me to help financially. Not just small support, they talked like it was my responsibility to provide long-term stability for him. They framed it as a family duty, saying that since I was successful now, it was only fair that I shared what I had built. I remember sitting there in silence, feeling a mix of disbelief and old childhood frustration creeping back in. Years of being ignored, compared, and treated like the backup child, and now suddenly I was important only because I could solve their problems. When I gently brought up the rumors and how deeply they had hurt me, they brushed it aside. They said my brother was just going through a hard time and didn't mean to cause real damage. It felt like my pain was invisible once again. The more they talked, the clearer it became: they weren't proud of my success, they saw it as a resource. Something they could use to maintain the same dynamic that had always existed in our family. That call left me shaking. Not just from anger, but from the realization that despite everything I had achieved, they still saw me through the same old lens, not as an independent adult, but as the backup plan who should fix what their golden child couldn't. And for the first time in my life, I knew I would have to give them an answer they weren't ready to hear. I took a few days before answering my parents. Honestly, I needed time just to breathe and figure out what I actually wanted, not what they expected from me. For years I had been the quiet one, the one who tried to keep peace and avoid conflict. But something inside me had shifted after everything that happened. When we finally talked again, I kept my voice calm. I told them I was sorry my brother was struggling, but I wasn't going to finance his life. I explained that I had worked incredibly hard to rebuild after the rumors and that my money, and my stability, were things I had earned for myself. The silence on the other end was heavy. Then came the reactions I had almost predicted. They said I had changed. They said success had made me selfish. They said a good daughter would help without hesitation. My mom's voice got sharp, accusing me of being ungrateful and cold. My dad reminded me of everything they had done for me growing up, even though deep down I knew most of my opportunities had come from my grandmother's support, not theirs. What hurt the most wasn't the anger, it was how quickly they dismissed my feelings again. They didn't ask why I felt uncomfortable. They didn't acknowledge my brother's role in nearly destroying my career. To them, the only problem was that I had refused to sacrifice myself for him. For the first time ever, I didn't back down. I told them that loving someone doesn't mean enabling harmful behavior, and that I deserved respect too. My hands were literally shaking while I said it, but I didn't apologize for my boundaries. After the call ended, I sat in my quiet living room, feeling both terrified and strangely relieved. It was painful to stand up to my parents, but it also felt like I had finally chosen myself, something I had never been allowed to do before. And that's when the real storm started. After I said no, things escalated fast, and not in a quiet, private way. Within days I started getting strange messages from relatives I barely spoke to. Some were subtle, asking if everything was okay between me and my parents. Others were blunt, accusing me of abandoning my family and refusing to help my brother when he needed me the most. It didn't take long to realize what had happened. My parents had told their version of the story, one where I was cold, selfish, and obsessed with money. They left out the rumors my brother had spread. They ignored the years I struggled alone. They painted themselves as hurt parents and me as the ungrateful daughter who forgot where she came from. Family group chats became uncomfortable. Invitations stopped coming. A few relatives called me directly, trying to pressure me into reconsidering my decision. Some even suggested that I owed my brother support because family is everything. At first, the guilt hit hard. That old childhood feeling came back, the pressure to fix everything and make everyone happy. I caught myself wondering if I was being too harsh, if maybe I should just give in to keep the peace. But then I remembered everything that had happened, the comparisons, the rumors, the lack of support when I needed it most. I realized that the narrative they were spreading wasn't just unfair, it erased my entire experience. One night I sat in my living room reading message after message, feeling like my past was trying to pull me back into the same role I had fought so hard to escape. The stress was overwhelming. I questioned myself more than once. And just when I felt completely alone, someone stepped forward who had always quietly watched everything, and finally decided it was time to speak up. Just when the pressure from my parents and relatives felt unbearable, my grandmother stepped in, and everything changed. She had been quietly watching the situation unfold, listening to the stories being spread and seeing how unfairly I was being portrayed. One evening she called a family gathering, something she rarely did unless it was serious. I didn't know what to expect, but I could tell from her voice that she wasn't going to stay silent anymore. In front of everyone, she calmly but firmly told the truth. She reminded them that she had been the one who supported my education when my parents chose not to. She spoke about the years she had seen me struggle alone, building my life without the help that my brother had always received. She didn't raise her voice, but every word carried weight. She also addressed the rumors and how much damage they had caused me. For the first time, someone acknowledged openly that my brother's actions had crossed a line and that expecting me to financially support him afterward was deeply unfair. The room went quiet. Some relatives looked uncomfortable. Others seemed genuinely surprised, like they were hearing a completely different version of the story for the first time. My parents tried to interrupt, but my grandmother didn't back down. She made it clear that love isn't measured by how much you sacrifice yourself for others, and that I had every right to protect what I had built. Hearing someone defend me so openly felt surreal. For years I had carried my experiences quietly, never expecting anyone to validate them publicly. That moment didn't magically fix the family dynamic, but it shifted the narrative in a way I never thought possible. For the first time, I wasn't the only voice telling my story. And after that gathering, the tension in the family changed, but so did my understanding of what real support and loyalty actually look like. After my grandmother spoke up, the family dynamic shifted in ways I didn't expect. Some relatives stopped pressuring me completely. A few even reached out privately to apologize for believing only one side of the story. It wasn't dramatic, just quiet messages saying they hadn't known everything and that they respected my boundaries now. My parents, on the other hand, reacted with cold silence. Calls stopped. Messages became rare and formal. At first, that distance hurt more than I wanted to admit. Even after everything, a part of me still hoped they would eventually understand my perspective and try to rebuild a healthier relationship. But as the weeks passed, something surprising happened. I started feeling lighter. Without constant criticism or emotional pressure, my days felt calmer. I focused more on my work, my friends, and creating a peaceful environment in the home I had worked so hard to buy. The anxiety that used to follow every family interaction slowly faded. I also began redefining what family meant to me. Instead of chasing approval from people who refused to see me fully, I invested more time in relationships built on mutual respect. My grandmother remained my strongest supporter, reminding me that boundaries are not acts of cruelty, they are acts of self-respect. Occasionally, I still felt waves of sadness when I thought about the childhood I wished I had or the version of my parents who might have been more supportive. But those feelings no longer controlled my decisions. I started accepting that not every relationship can be fixed, and that protecting my peace was just as important as maintaining family ties. The silence from my parents wasn't the closure I imagined, but it gave me space to grow into a version of myself that felt stronger and more secure than ever before. And with that space came the chance to reflect, not just on what I lost, but on everything I had gained by standing up for myself. Months passed before anything shifted again. Life had settled into a quieter rhythm, work, friends, small routines that made my days feel steady. I wasn't waiting for my parents to reach out anymore, but I also wasn't completely closed off to the possibility. Then one evening, out of nowhere, my father sent a short message, "Can we talk?" I stared at my phone for a long time before replying. Part of me felt nervous, old memories of arguments and guilt trips resurfaced instantly. Another part of me felt strangely calm. I knew I wasn't the same person who used to panic or immediately try to fix everything. I had boundaries now, and I trusted myself to keep them. We agreed to meet in a quiet cafe. The conversation was different. Not perfect, there were still moments where he tried to minimize my feelings, but there were also pauses where he listened instead of interrupting. He admitted that the situation with the house had escalated further than he expected and that the family tension had affected everyone more than he realized. It wasn't an apology in the way I once dreamed of. There were no big emotional speeches or sudden transformations. But there was something new, a willingness to have an actual conversation without yelling or manipulation. I spoke honestly, calmly, and without trying to convince him to agree with me. I explained that I wasn't trying to punish anyone, I was protecting my independence and the life I had built. For the first time, I didn't feel like I needed his approval to validate my choices. We left the cafe without hugging, without dramatic closure, just a quiet understanding that maybe, slowly, things could change if both of us were willing to respect new boundaries. Walking back home, I realized something important: healing doesn't always come in big, cinematic moments. Sometimes it starts with a single conversation where you remain true to yourself, and leave without losing your peace.